Harold Mackenzie's weathered hands trembled as he placed the final wildflower on his granddaughter's headstone, the morning silence of Willowbrook Cemetery broken only by the gentle Nebraska breeze. The memorial service for 5-year-old Emma Rose had drawn 43 neighbors, their hushed voices offering comfort that felt as empty as his pension account. Then the howling began. 7 stray dogs emerged from the oak tree line like ghosts materializing from grief itself. Not the random pack the town council wanted destroyed, but Harold's secret companions, the mutts he'd rescued with his last $200. They moved with terrifying purpose toward Emma's fresh grave, their golden-eyed leader releasing a mournful cry that seemed to carry his granddaughter's name across the hillside. "Get them away from here!" Mrs. Patterson shrieked, clutching her purse as the German shepherd began digging frantically at the soft earth. But Harold's heart stopped when the dog's claws struck plastic instead of wood, revealing not his beloved Emma, but a garbage bag stuffed with broken dolls and a note scrawled in desperate handwriting, "I have your granddaughter." If Emma wasn't buried here, where was she? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Harold Mackenzie had been a different man. At 67, the retired coal miner lived alone in a weathered farmhouse on the outskirts of Willowbrook, Nebraska, surviving on an $847 monthly pension that barely covered the mortgage his late wife Sarah had left behind. The medical bills from her 3-year battle with cancer, $67,000 in debt that crushed his shoulders like the mine shafts he'd worked for 40 years, had stripped away everything except the faded wedding photo on his kitchen table and the memory of her final words. "Promise me you'll take care of our boy's little girl if something happens," Sarah had whispered, her fingers cold as winter stone. Harold had promised, never imagining he'd need to honor that vow so soon. When their son Michael died in a mining accident 2 years later, 5-year-old Emma Rose Mackenzie became Harold's entire world. The bright-eyed child with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile moved into the spare bedroom, transforming Harold's tomb of grief into something resembling a home again. She filled the silence with laughter, covered the refrigerator with crayon drawings of me and Grandpa Hal forever, and never complained when dinner consisted of generic mac and cheese for the 4th night running. Emma's asthma medication cost $340 monthly, nearly half Harold's pension. He'd pawned Sarah's jewelry, sold his truck for a rusted pickup, and swallowed his pride to accept the church food bank's offerings. Still, some nights he'd sit at that kitchen table, counting and recounting crumpled bills, wondering how long he could keep the lights on and the medicine cabinet stocked. The 7 stray dogs had wandered onto his property last spring, a ragtag pack abandoned when their owner skipped town ahead of the sheriff. Harold found them huddled in his barn during a thunderstorm, hungry, scared, desperate. Despite having no money for pet food, he couldn't turn them away. Emma named them Faith, Hope, Courage, Loyal, Brave, True, and Guardian, insisting they were our guardian angels with fur. The Willowbrook Town Council disagreed. Mayor Patricia Hendricks called them a public menace and health hazard, demanding Harold remove them immediately or face fines he couldn't afford. Neighbors whispered behind screen doors about the crazy old man who can't even feed himself, let alone a child and 7 dogs. Dr. Catherine Sullivan had seemed different during Emma's routine checkups. The 52-year-old family physician showed unusual interest in their living situation, asking pointed questions about Harold's income, Emma's future plans, whether he'd considered other arrangements for the child's welfare. She'd lost her own daughter, Margaret, in a drowning accident years earlier, she confided, and understood how precious and fragile a grandparent's love could be. "Some children deserve every opportunity life can offer," Dr. Sullivan had said during their last visit, watching Emma color in the waiting room corner. It's heartbreaking when circumstances prevent that. Harold had agreed, never suspecting those words contained a threat disguised as sympathy. The morning of September 15th started like any other in the Mackenzie household. Harold woke at 5:30, as he had for 40 years of mining shifts, and shuffled to the kitchen to brew coffee in the dented aluminum pot that had belonged to his father. Emma appeared 20 minutes later, still in her Winnie the Pooh pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes and asking if the puppy angels could have breakfast too. They'd established this routine over the past 18 months. Harold would fill 7 mismatched bowls with whatever kibble he could afford, while Emma arranged them in a perfect circle on the back porch. The dogs approached cautiously, Faith always first, the German shepherd's golden eyes never leaving Harold's face as if seeking permission for each bite. "Grandpa Hal, why don't other people like our dogs?" Emma asked that morning, settling cross-legged beside Guardian, the smallest of the pack, a border collie mix whose left ear had been torn in some long-ago fight. Harold paused, his weathered hands gripping the coffee mug that had "World's Best Dad" printed in fading blue letters. How could he explain to a 5-year-old that people feared what they didn't understand? That a town struggling to survive saw 7 stray dogs as just another burden, another mouth to feed in a place where everyone was already hungry. "People get scared when they don't know something's story, darling," he said finally. "They look at our dogs and see trouble, but you and I know they're just looking for a family." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Like me. I was looking for family too, and I found you." The words hit Harold like a fist to the chest. This child, who'd lost both parents before she could properly remember their faces, still believed in the goodness of finding home. He swallowed hard, tasting the bitterness of coffee and regret. By noon, Emma's energy had reached its typical peak. She'd finished her morning coloring. Today's masterpiece showed 7 dogs wearing angel wings, protecting a little girl and an old man from storm clouds, and was bouncing around the living room like a rubber ball. "Can we go to Miller's Pond, Grandpa? Please, the doggies need exercise and I want to look for pretty rocks." Harold glanced at the bills spread across his kitchen table. The electric company had sent a final notice, and Emma's inhaler was nearly empty. But the September afternoon was crisp and golden, the kind of day Sarah used to call God's apology for winter coming, and Emma's pleading expression could melt granite. "All right, sweetheart, but we stay close to shore, you hear me? And if I say it's time to go, no arguments." Miller's Pond sat 2 miles from town, a natural swimming hole surrounded by cattails and willow trees where generations of Willowbrook children had learned to skip stones and catch fireflies. Harold had proposed to Sarah here in 1978, fumbling with a ring that cost 3 weeks' wages and nearly dropping it in the shallow water when she said yes. The 7 dogs bounded ahead as they walked the dirt path, their excitement infectious. Emma skipped between them, collecting acorns and chattering about school, her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, and the upcoming harvest festival. Harold listened with half his attention, the other half calculating whether he could afford both groceries and the electric bill this month. They reached the pond at 2:15. Harold settled on a fallen log while Emma waded in the shallows, her rolled-up jeans already soaked to the knees. The dogs patrolled the perimeter, Faith positioning herself between Emma and the deeper water with the precision of a trained lifeguard. "I see a really pretty one," Emma called, pointing toward a rock formation about 10 feet from shore. "It's all sparkly, Grandpa." "Stay where you can touch bottom, Em," Harold called back. But he was distracted, pulling his phone from his pocket to check a text from the bank. Another overdraft fee. $29 for being $3 short on the automatic payment. The splash happened while he was staring at the screen. Harold's head snapped up to see Emma's empty hands breaking the surface, her mouth open in a soundless gasp before she disappeared beneath the murky water. She'd slipped on the algae-covered rocks, her small body pulled under by the unexpected depth where spring runoff had carved a hidden channel. "Emma!" Harold plunged into the pond, his arthritic knees screaming as he fought through the water. The dogs erupted in frantic barking, Faith and Courage diving in beside him while the others paced the shore in agitation. Harold found her floating face down 20 feet from shore, her blonde hair fanned around her head like pond weeds. He hauled her unconscious body to the shallow water, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. She wasn't breathing. "Come on, baby girl, come on," he gasped, pressing his mouth to hers, forcing air into her lungs the way he'd learned in mine safety training decades ago. 1 breath. 2. Her chest rose and fell, but her eyes remained closed. His hands shook as he dialed 911, Emma's limp form cradled against his chest while the 7 dogs formed a protective circle around them. The dispatcher's calm voice contrasted sharply with Harold's panic. "Sir, I need you to stay on the line. The ambulance is 7 minutes out." 7 minutes felt like 7 hours. Harold alternated between rescue breathing and pleading with God, with Sarah, with anyone who might be listening. "Don't take her too. I can't lose her too. She's all I have left in this world." When the ambulance arrived, Dr. Catherine Sullivan stepped out behind the paramedics, her medical bag in hand and her expression professionally grave. Harold had called her directly after 911, knowing she lived only 5 minutes from Miller's Pond. "Harold, step back and let us work," she said, kneeling beside Emma's motionless form. Her examination was thorough but brief, checking pupils, pulse, reflexes. After what felt like eternity, she looked up with the expression Harold had learned to dread from Sarah's cancer treatments. "The head trauma is severe," Dr. Sullivan said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of unwelcome experience. "I'm sorry, Harold. The brain swelling. There's nothing we can do." The words hit him like a mine shaft collapse, crushing the air from his lungs. No, she was just playing. She was just looking for rocks. Sometimes these accidents— Dr. Sullivan's voice trailed off. "I'll handle the arrangements. You don't need to worry about the costs or the details. Focus on saying goodbye." Harold collapsed beside Emma's still form, his rough hands smoothing her wet hair, while tears he'd held back for 3 years finally broke free. Around them 7 dogs sat in silent vigil, their eyes reflecting a sorrow that seemed almost human. He never noticed Dr. Sullivan making a phone call or the way she insisted on personally transporting Emma's body. He was drowning in his own grief, unable to see the careful orchestration of his worst nightmare. The memorial service 3 days later should have been a quiet affair, a grieving grandfather saying goodbye to the light of his life. Instead, it became the moment that shattered Harold Mackenzie's understanding of truth itself. 43 neighbors had gathered at Riverside Cemetery under the September sun, their faces etched with the practiced sympathy of a small town that had buried too many dreams. Reverend Patterson stood beside Emma's small headstone, his weathered Bible open to Psalms, while Harold clutched a handful of wildflowers Emma had loved, black-eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace picked from the roadside on their walks together. "We gather not to mourn a life cut short," Reverend Patterson intoned, "but to celebrate the joy Emma Rose brought to all who knew her." Harold barely heard the words. He stared at the fresh mound of earth, trying to reconcile the reality of Emma lying 6 feet below with the memory of her laughter echoing through their kitchen just 4 days ago. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's kindergarten teacher, had brought the child's final art project, a crayon drawing of 7 dogs with wings, protecting a little girl and an old man from dark storm clouds. "She drew this the day before," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, pressing the paper into Harold's trembling hands. "She said the angels would always watch over you." The mourners shared their memories in hushed tones. Emma's bright smile, her determination to feed every stray animal in Willowbrook, the way she'd corrected adults who mispronounced her name. "It's Emma Rose, like the flower, not just Emma." Harold tried to speak, to offer some words of gratitude for their presence, but his throat closed like a mine shaft cave-in. "How do you thank people for witnessing the burial of your reason to keep breathing?" Then the howling began. The sound cut through the cemetery's respectful silence like a blade through silk, a mournful cry that seemed to carry Emma's name on the autumn wind. Every head turned toward the oak trees that bordered the cemetery, where 7 familiar shapes emerged from the shadows. Faith led them, her golden coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, followed by the others in single file. Hope, courage, loyal, brave, true, and guardian. They moved with purpose. Harold had never seen before their usual cautious approach to strangers replaced by something approaching desperation. "What are they doing here?" Mayor Hendricks hissed, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Somebody call animal control immediately." But Harold found himself stepping forward instead of back. Something in Faith's posture reminded him of Emma's behavior when she was trying to communicate something urgent. The same focused intensity, the same frustrated energy when words weren't enough to convey what mattered most. The pack approached Emma's grave and began to circle it, their movements agitated, almost frantic. Faith stopped directly above where Emma's casket should rest and released another howling cry that raised goosebumps on Harold's arms. The sound wasn't random animal noise, it was communication, urgent and desperate. "Get those mangy beasts away from here!" Mrs. Patterson shrieked, waving her black purse at them. "This is sacred ground. Have you no respect?" Harold raised his weathered hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Faith's face. The German shepherd's golden eyes met his across the space between grief and hope, and Harold saw something there that made his heart skip. Recognition, intelligence, and an urgency that transcended species. Faith began to dig. Her powerful paws struck the soft earth with systematic precision, dirt flying in controlled arcs as she worked. This wasn't random destruction, it was purposeful excavation. Courage joined her, then hope, until all 7 dogs were digging with the coordination Harold had witnessed in mine rescue operations. "Stop them!" someone shouted from the crowd, but Harold stepped closer instead. These weren't wild animals causing chaos at his granddaughter's funeral. Their movements were too organized, too deliberate. Faith would dig several scoops, then step back to let the smaller dogs clear the loose earth before resuming. It was teamwork, born of intelligence and purpose. "Harold, please," Reverend Patterson pleaded, "we need to maintain the dignity of this service." But dignity meant nothing when measured against the possibility that these dogs knew something the humans had missed. Harold knelt at the edge of the growing hole, his arthritic knees protesting against the cemetery's hard ground. Within minutes, the pack had excavated nearly 3 feet when Faith's claws struck something that made a hollow, plasticky sound. Not the solid thunk of wood against earth, not the metallic ring of a casket's hardware. Something that crinkled and shifted like garbage. Faith stepped back and barked twice, short, sharp commands that seemed to say, "Look here, understand this." Harold peered into the hole on trembling legs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. There, partially exposed in the disturbed earth, lay a large black garbage bag, the industrial kind used for yard waste, tied at the top with yellow rope. As the bag shifted in the loose dirt, its contents spilled through a tear in the plastic. Dozens of baby dolls, their plastic faces staring up at Harold with vacant blue eyes. All blonde, all approximately 5 years old in size. All wearing clothes similar to what Emma had worn on her last day. Pinned to the bag with a safety pin was a handwritten note, the writing shaky and desperate. "I have your granddaughter. She is safe from your poverty now. Do not look for us." Harold's world tilted sideways. The cemetery, the mourners, the reality he'd accepted for 3 days, all of it crumbled like a poorly supported mine shaft. His hands shook as he reached for the note, needing to touch it to believe it existed. A second piece of paper lay beneath the first, this one in the same handwriting but more frantic. "Margaret would be 15 today. I failed her, but I won't fail Emma. She deserves better than scraping by on handouts." The cemetery erupted into chaos. Mrs. Patterson screamed. Mayor Hendricks fumbled for her cell phone. Reverend Patterson staggered backward, his Bible falling into the pile of disturbed earth. But Harold stared into that hole with a mixture of horror and impossible hope blooming in his chest. If Emma wasn't buried here, if this grave contained nothing but dolls and the ravings of someone who thought poverty was worse than death. "My Emma," he whispered, his voice breaking on her name. She might still be alive. Faith sat back on her haunches and looked directly at Harold, her intelligent eyes reflecting something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. The other 6 dogs arranged themselves around the excavated gravesite like sentinels, their job complete, but their vigil continuing. Detective Mike Rodriguez arrived within 20 minutes, his squad car's lights painting red and blue streaks across the headstones. Behind him came the county coroner, a crime scene photographer, and 2 more patrol units responding to what dispatch had logged as grave desecration with possible kidnapping implications. "Sir, I need you to step away from the scene," Rodriguez said gently, his hand on Harold's shoulder. "We're going to treat this as a crime scene until we know what we're dealing with." Harold stood on unsteady legs, his fingers still clutching the note that had turned his world upside down. "Detective, my granddaughter." The funeral home said they'd already received her body for preparation. Dr. Sullivan handled all the arrangements personally. Rodriguez made a note in his pad. "Dr. Catherine Sullivan from Willowbrook Medical?" "She was at the accident scene, said there was nothing she could do, that the brain trauma was too severe." Harold's voice grew stronger as the implications crystallized. "But if Emma isn't in this grave, then we need to have a serious conversation with Dr. Sullivan." Rodriguez looked at the 7 dogs who hadn't moved from their positions around the grave. "These the dogs that did the digging?" Harold nodded, unable to trust his voice. "Well," Rodriguez said, surveying the scene, "looks like they just solved a case we didn't even know we had." As crime scene tape went up around Emma's empty grave, Harold felt something shift inside his chest, the first stirring of hope he'd experienced since watching his granddaughter disappear beneath Miller's Pond's dark surface. The 7 dogs pressed close around him, their warm bodies providing comfort and strength. Somewhere out there, Emma Rose Mackenzie might still be alive. And these 4-legged angels had refused to let her grandfather bury a lie. The Willowbrook Police Department hadn't seen this much activity since the grain elevator fire of 1987. Detective Mike Rodriguez commandeered the small conference room, spreading crime scene photographs across the table while Harold sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, the 7 dogs waiting patiently in the parking lot under Officer Janet Martinez's watchful eye. "Mr. Mackenzie, I need you to walk me through every interaction you had with Dr. Sullivan," Rodriguez said, his pen poised over a fresh notepad. "Start from the beginning and don't leave out any detail, no matter how small it seems." Harold's weathered hands clasped and unclasped as he forced his mind back through the fog of grief. She's been Emma's doctor for about 8 months. Real professional, always seemed to care. Asked a lot of questions about our situation. What kind of questions? About money, mostly. Whether I could afford Emma's medications, if we had family who might help out. Said she understood how hard it was raising a child on a fixed income. Harold paused, remembering. She lost her own daughter, Margaret. Drowning accident 10 years back. Said it made her extra careful with other people's children. Rodriguez made notes, his expression growing more serious. Did she ever suggest alternative arrangements for Emma's care? Once or twice, real subtle-like. Said some children deserved every opportunity life could offer, that it was heartbreaking when circumstances prevented that. Harold's voice turned bitter. I thought she was being sympathetic. Never occurred to me she might be evaluating us. The detective's radio crackled. Rodriguez, we've got movement on that address. Dr. Sullivan's farmhouse looks occupied, fresh tire tracks, lights on timer. Copy that. I'll be there in 20. Rodriguez turned back to Harold. Sir, I need you to stay here while we check out her property. If Emma is there, we don't want to spook anyone into doing something desperate. But Harold was already standing, his jaw set with determination that reminded Rodriguez of the old coal miners who'd built this town with their bare hands and stubborn will. Detective, that's my granddaughter. I've been digging in dangerous places my whole life. I'm not sitting in some office chair while she needs me. Mr. Mackenzie. Those dogs found her when your forensics team didn't even know she was missing, Harold interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd supervised mining crews for 20 years. They're not staying behind either. We all go, or I find my own way there. Rodriguez looked at the old man's weathered face, seeing the same iron determination that had kept him searching abandoned mine shafts for trapped men, the same refusal to accept defeat that had built half the structures in Willowbrook. Sometimes regulations had to bend when lives were at stake. All right. But you stay in the vehicle until we secure the scene, and those dogs stay leashed. 20 minutes later, a convoy of 3 police cruisers wound through the hills outside Willowbrook, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the Nebraska countryside. Harold rode in the passenger seat of Rodriguez's cruiser, the 7 dogs loaded into Officer Martinez's specially equipped K9 unit behind them. Dr. Sullivan's property sat at the end of a winding gravel road, isolated by 30 acres of overgrown farmland. The farmhouse itself was modest, white clapboard siding that needed paint, a sagging front porch, shuttered windows that revealed nothing of what lay inside. But Harold's heart nearly stopped when he saw the children's toys scattered across the yard. A pink tricycle, exactly like the one Emma had outgrown last year, a sandbox with fresh digging marks, a wooden swing hanging from the old oak tree, still moving slightly in the evening breeze. Jesus, Rodriguez muttered, reaching for his radio. Control, this is Unit 7. We're going to need backup in a medical unit at 1247 Pine Ridge Road. Possible kidnapping situation confirmed. Faith began whining in the K9 unit, her nose pressed against the window, body trembling with excitement or anxiety. Harold couldn't tell which. The other dogs joined in, creating a low chorus of distress that raised every hair on his arms. They smell her, Harold said with sudden certainty. Emma's here. Rodriguez deployed his officers around the perimeter while Harold waited in the cruiser, every second feeling like an eternity. Through the farmhouse windows he could see movement, shadows crossing behind the curtains, the faint glow of lamplight. Then, carrying across the distance like a prayer being answered, came the sound that stopped Harold's heart, a child's voice singing a lullaby Emma had learned in kindergarten. London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. That's her, Harold whispered, his hands pressed against the cruiser's window. That's my Emma. Rodriguez approached the farmhouse with tactical precision, his service weapon drawn but held low. "Dr. Sullivan, this is the Willowbrook Police Department. We need to speak with you about Emma Mackenzie." The singing stopped abruptly. For a long moment, the farmhouse stood silent, its windows like eyes that revealed nothing. Then a voice called from inside, thin and strained. "She's safe here. Safer than she's ever been. You can't have her back." "Doctor, we just want to talk. No one needs to get hurt." "Hurt?" Dr. Sullivan's laugh carried an edge of hysteria. "Do you know what hurt looks like, officer? It's a 5-year-old girl wearing the same dress 3 days in a row because her grandfather can't afford laundry detergent. It's watching a bright child's potential wasted because no one has money for books or proper medical care." Harold couldn't stay in the cruiser any longer. He opened the door despite Rodriguez's sharp gesture to remain inside, walking slowly toward the farmhouse with his hands visible and empty. The 7 dogs followed, somehow having escaped from the K-9 unit, their leashes dragging behind them. "Kate!" Harold called, using her first name deliberately. "I know you think you're protecting her. I know you lost your Margaret, and I'm sorry for that. But Emma belongs with her family." A curtain twitched in an upstairs window. Harold caught a glimpse of blonde hair, a small face pressed against the glass. "Emma Rose!" he called, his voice cracking with emotion. "Grandpa's here, baby girl!" The front door opened slowly, revealing Dr. Catherine Sullivan in clothes she'd been wearing for days, her usually professional appearance disheveled and wild. She held a sedative syringe in one hand and a cell phone in the other. "Don't come any closer," she warned, but her voice lacked conviction. "I've already called the Ashworths. They're flying in from California tonight. Emma will have everything. Private schools, college funds, medical care whenever she needs it." "The Ashworths?" Rodriguez kept his weapon trained on Sullivan while speaking. "Who are the Ashworths? Good people, wealthy people. People who can give Emma the life she deserves instead of watching her waste away in that falling-down shack with a man too old and too poor to properly care for her." Harold took another step forward, Faith moving protectively beside him. "Kate, look at me. Really look. Do you see a man who doesn't love his granddaughter? Do you see someone who would hurt her?" Dr. Sullivan's composure cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I see a man who loves her enough to let her go hungry rather than burden the state system. I see someone who'll work himself to death trying to provide for her and fail anyway. Just like I failed Margaret." "How did you fail Margaret?" "I was texting during her swimming lesson. 3 seconds of not watching, and she drowned in 18 inches of water." Sullivan's voice broke completely. "If I'd been a better mother, if I'd been paying attention instead of worried about some patient's lab results." Harold felt the pieces clicking together like mine shaft supports falling into place. "So you decided to save Emma from having an imperfect guardian." "The Ashworths lost their daughter in a car accident. They have unlimited resources, endless love to give. Emma will want for nothing. Except her real family." Harold's voice grew stronger. "Kate, I've been poor my whole life. Grew up in a house with no indoor plumbing, shared a bed with 3 brothers. You know what we had that money can't buy? We had each other. We had people who knew our stories, our jokes, our fears. We belonged somewhere." Faith whined softly and took another step toward the house. The other dogs followed, not aggressively, but with the determined patience they'd shown at the cemetery. "Those mutts again," Sullivan said bitterly. "More mouths you can't afford to feed." "Those dogs saved Emma's life today," Rodriguez interjected. "They're the only reason we found her at all." Through the upstairs window, Emma's face appeared again. This time she pressed both palms against the glass, her mouth forming words Harold couldn't hear but could read. "Grandpa Hal." "She sees you," Sullivan said, noticing Harold's upward gaze. She asks for you constantly. I've been telling her you died in the same accident that killed her, that you went to heaven with Grandma Sarah, but she doesn't believe me. She keeps drawing pictures of you and those damn dogs. Harold's heart clenched. Let me see her, Kate. Just let me talk to her. So you can fill her head with promises you can't keep? So you can take her back to that poverty trap and watch her potential die a slow death? Sullivan raised the syringe. The Ashworths will be here in 3 hours. Emma will be asleep for the transition. It's better this way. No. The voice came from the upstairs window, clear and defiant despite being muffled by glass. I don't want new people. I want Grandpa Hal and my puppy Angels. Emma had opened the window and was leaning out, her 5-year-old voice carrying the stubborn determination Harold recognized from her grandmother Sarah. Dr. Lizzie, you lied. Grandpa isn't dead, and I'm not going anywhere without my family. The standoff stretched taut as a suspension cable. Dr. Sullivan, with her syringe and desperate justifications. Rodriguez, with his weapon and legal authority. Harold with nothing but love and the unshakable conviction that families belonged together, regardless of their bank accounts. Then Faith made the decision for all of them. The German Shepherd bounded up the farmhouse steps and pushed through the partially open door before anyone could react. Her bark echoed from inside the house, followed by Emma's delighted squeal. "Faith, you found me! Good girl! Good girl!" The spell broken, Harold ran toward the house with Rodriguez and the other officers close behind. They found Dr. Sullivan standing in the living room, the syringe fallen from her nerveless fingers, watching as Emma flew down the stairs and threw herself into Harold's arms. "Grandpa Hal! I knew you weren't dead. I knew you'd come find me." Emma buried her face in his neck, her small body shaking with relief and joy. Harold held her tight enough to convince himself she was real, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the lingering smell of the stuffed animals Dr. Sullivan had surrounded her with, "I'm here, baby girl. Grandpa's here, and I'm never letting you go again." Faith sat beside them, her tail wagging slowly, while the other 6 dogs arranged themselves in their familiar protective circle. Guardian pressed close to Emma's legs, accepting the scratches behind his ears she'd missed giving for 3 days. Dr. Sullivan sank into a chair, her face in her hands. "She would have had everything," she whispered. "Music lessons, art camps, the best universities." "She has something better," Harold said gently, still holding Emma close. "She has people who knew her before she was born, who'll love her when she's cranky and sick and making mistakes. She has a place where she belongs, not because she's perfect, but because she's ours." Rodriguez handcuffed Dr. Sullivan with professional courtesy, reading her rights while EMTs checked Emma for signs of harm. Physically, she appeared uninjured, well-fed, clean, showing no signs of abuse beyond the trauma of believing her grandfather was dead. "The Ashworths," Sullivan said as Rodriguez led her toward the door, "you need to arrest them too. They've done this before. Other children, other desperate situations. They pay $50,000 per placement." Harold's blood chilled. "How many others, Kate?" "I don't know. The network is bigger than just Willowbrook. Doctors, social workers, people who thought they were saving children from inadequate homes." She looked back at Emma, who was showing Faith a drawing she'd made during her captivity. "Maybe I was wrong. Maybe love is enough, even when money isn't." As the police cars pulled away from the farmhouse, Emma fell asleep in Harold's lap, exhausted by emotion and the settling realization that her world was safe again. The 7 dogs rode quietly in the K-9 unit, their mission complete, their pack reunited. "Mr. Mackenzie," Rodriguez said as they drove back toward town, "we're going to need Emma examined by a pediatric psychologist, and there'll be court proceedings. Dr. Sullivan will likely face federal charges if this trafficking network is as extensive as she claims. Harold nodded, stroking Emma's hair. Whatever she needs, however long it takes. There's something else. The media's gotten wind of this story. Dogs digging up fake graves, uncovering kidnapping rings. It's going to draw attention, national attention. Harold considered this, watching the Nebraska countryside roll past in the gathering dusk. 3 days ago, he'd been a forgotten old man burying his reason to live. Now he was holding that reason in his arms again, surrounded by 7 four-legged miracles who'd refused to let him accept a lie as truth. "Let them come," he said finally. "Maybe it's time the world learned that family isn't about having money. It's about having people who won't give up on you even when everything seems hopeless." Emma stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. "Grandpa Hal? Are we going home now?" "Yes, darling. We're going home. All of us? Even the puppy angels?" Harold looked back at the 7 dogs, their eyes reflecting the dashboard lights like stars in the darkness. Faith met his gaze through the partition and seemed to nod, a gesture of understanding that transcended species. "All of us," he confirmed. "We're all going home together." The Willowbrook Medical Center's pediatric wing had never hosted an FBI task force before. Agent Sarah Chen arrived from Omaha 3 hours after Emma's rescue, her federal credentials opening doors that local law enforcement couldn't access. She found Harold in the family waiting area, Emma sleeping fitfully in his lap while the 7 dogs lay in formation around his chair, a living barrier between the child and the world that had tried to steal her. "Mr. Mackenzie, I'm Agent Chen. I need to ask you some difficult questions about Dr. Sullivan and what Emma might have witnessed during her captivity." Harold studied the agent's face, seeing the same controlled intensity he'd recognized in mine safety inspectors, people whose job required them to imagine the worst-case scenarios. "Emma's been through enough. She's not talking to anyone until she's ready." "Sir, I understand your protective instincts, but we have reason to believe Dr. Sullivan was part of a much larger operation." The names she gave us, the Ashworths, this Second Chances network, we're tracking similar cases in 6 states, children who supposedly died in accidents, bodies that were never properly examined, wealthy families who adopted through private arrangements. The words hit Harold like falling mine timber. How many children? We don't know yet. But if Emma can identify faces, locations, anything she overheard during her captivity. Agent Chen's voice gentled. She might be the key to bringing dozens of children home. Emma stirred in Harold's arms, her eyes opening with the startled confusion of someone waking in an unfamiliar place. The antiseptic smell of the hospital, the harsh fluorescent lighting, the strange voices, all of it combined to trigger the anxiety she'd been suppressing since her rescue. "Grandpa Hal, where are we? Why does everything smell like Dr. Lizzie's office?" Her small voice carried a tremor that cut straight through Harold's heart. "We're at the hospital, darling. The doctors just want to make sure you're okay. Then we're going home." But Emma's eyes had found Agent Chen, and something in the woman's official bearing triggered a memory. "She looks like the other lady, the one who came to see Dr. Lizzie before the airplane people were supposed to come." Agent Chen leaned forward carefully, her voice soft. "Emma, can you tell me about the airplane people?" Emma pressed closer to Harold, her fingers clutching Faith's fur through the gap in the chair arms. "They had lots of money. Dr. Lizzie showed me pictures of their big house with a swimming pool. She said they lost their little girl and needed someone to love." "Did you want to go with them?" "No!" Emma's response was immediate and fierce. "I told Dr. Lizzie I already had someone to love me, but she said Grandpa Hal was too old and too poor, and the airplane people could give me everything I needed." Harold's jaw tightened. Even in her twisted logic, Dr. Sullivan had been trying to convince Emma that the kidnapping was somehow for her own good. The other lady brought papers, Emma continued, her child's memory surprisingly clear. She talked about money, lots of numbers. Dr. Lizzie seemed scared of her. Agent Chen made notes rapidly. Emma, did this other lady have a name? Mrs. something with a V. She wore sparkly earrings and smelled like flowers. She said I was perfect for the placement, and that the airplane people were eager for delivery. Emma's voice took on the careful pronunciation of a child repeating adult words she didn't fully understand. The clinical language made Harold's stomach turn. Placement, delivery. As if Emma was a package being shipped rather than a child being torn from her family. Dr. Patricia Novak, the pediatric psychologist, arrived with the careful bearing of someone accustomed to working with traumatized children. She knelt beside Emma's chair, bringing herself to the child's eye level without invading her space. Hi, Emma. I'm Dr. Novak. I talk to children about their feelings. Would it be okay if we talked for a few minutes? Emma looked to Harold for permission, receiving his encouraging nod before responding. Are you going to tell me my grandpa Hal can't take care of me? Not at all. I can see how much you and your grandfather love each other. I just want to make sure you're feeling safe and happy. The gentle questioning revealed the full scope of Dr. Sullivan's psychological manipulation. Emma had been told repeatedly that Harold was dead, that she had no other family, that the Ashworths represented her only chance for a normal life. When Emma refused to believe these lies, Dr. Sullivan had shown her newspaper clippings about poverty in rural America, statistics about children failing in underfunded schools, stories about elderly guardians dying and leaving children in foster care. She said I would end up in a place with lots of other kids who nobody wanted, Emma whispered. She said if I went with the airplane people, I could visit Grandpa Hal in heaven someday. Harold closed his eyes, fighting back rage at the systematic way Dr. Sullivan had tried to break his granddaughter's spirit. Faith sensed his tension and pressed closer, her warm presence a reminder that Emma was safe now. Agent Chen's phone buzzed with an urgent message. She stepped away to take the call, her expression growing grimmer with each passing minute. When she returned, her professional composure had slipped slightly. Mr. Mackenzie, we've just raided an address in California, the Ashworths' residence. We found evidence of at least 12 adoptions over the past 5 years, including documentation suggesting they were paying between $40,000 and $70,000 per child. And the children? We're locating them now. Most are with the Ashworths' extended network, friends, relatives, people who believed the adoptions were legitimate. But Emma, Agent Chen paused, choosing her words carefully. She would have been different. The paperwork suggests she was intended as a replacement daughter for the Ashworths' own child who died. They wanted a specific age, appearance, and background. The implication hung heavy in the sterile hospital air. Emma hadn't been randomly selected. She'd been specifically targeted because she matched the Ashworths' grief-driven criteria. Dr. Novak finished her evaluation with cautious optimism. Emma shows remarkable resilience. The fact that she never stopped believing in your return likely protected her from the worst psychological damage. However, she'll need ongoing counseling to process this experience fully. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Emma suddenly turned to Agent Chen. The other lady, Mrs. V, she had a book with pictures of more kids who looked sad. She told Dr. Lizzie there were 6 more placements scheduled for this quarter. Agent Chen's eyes sharpened. Emma, do you remember anything else about this book? What the pictures looked like? Some of the kids were crying. Some looked scared. There was a boy with red hair who looked like my friend Tommy from school but older, and a little girl with curly black hair who was holding a teddy bear. Emma's voice grew smaller. Doctor, Lizzie said they were all going to better homes, but they didn't look happy about it. The drive back to Harold's farmhouse should have been a celebration. Instead, it felt like the calm before a larger storm. Local news vans had gathered at the end of his gravel driveway, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like technological vultures. Harold could see reporters checking their makeup in side mirrors, preparing for the live broadcast that would turn his granddaughter's ordeal into evening entertainment. "Grandpa Hal, why are all those people here?" Emma pressed her face to the car window, watching the media circus with 5-year-old curiosity. "They want to tell everyone about how smart our dogs are," Harold said, which was true enough. "But we don't have to talk to them if you don't want to." Detective Rodriguez had radioed ahead, and Officer Martinez was waiting at Harold's front door to escort them inside. The 7 dogs immediately claimed their familiar positions around the living room, as if their 3-day absence had never happened. Faith settled beside Emma's chair while Guardian took his usual post by the window. The phone began ringing within minutes of their arrival. Reporters, distant relatives Harold hadn't heard from in years, neighbors wanting to express their relief. Harold unplugged it after the 5th call, needing silence to process everything that had happened. Emma went straight to her room, returning with an armload of drawings she'd completed during her captivity. Harold spread them across the kitchen table, studying his granddaughter's artistic documentation of her ordeal. Most showed herself in a room with barred windows, surrounded by toys she'd never asked for. But in every picture, 7 dogs with wings hovered at the edges, and in the corner stood a figure labeled Grandpa Hal in Heaven. "I never stopped drawing you," Emma said, settling onto Harold's lap. "Dr. Lizzie said I should forget about my old family and think about my new one, but I couldn't. Every time I tried to forget, Faith would howl outside my window. Even when they weren't there, I could hear them calling for me." Harold felt tears he'd been suppressing finally break free. "They never stopped looking for you, darling. None of us did." Agent Chen called that evening with updates that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The Second Chances Network had been operating for 7 years, targeting families in financial distress across rural America. Their selection criteria were coldly calculated: single, elderly guardians, children with no other relatives, communities too small to have adequate social services oversight. Dr. Sullivan appears to have been a mid-level recruiter, Agent Chen explained. She identified potential targets during routine medical care, then passed the information up the chain. The organization had social workers who would create false emergencies, doctors who would declare children dead without proper autopsies, and wealthy couples who paid premium prices for children who matched their specific requirements. Harold listened with growing horror as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Emma hadn't been Sullivan's first victim. She'd been part of a systematic exploitation of rural poverty, a business model that turned desperate families' circumstances into profit margins. How many other children like Emma? We're still calculating. But based on the financial records we've recovered, we estimate at least 47 children were trafficked through this network over the past 7 years. As night fell over Willowbrook, Harold sat on his front porch with Emma curled in his lap, watching the news vans finally pack up and leave. The 7 dogs had arranged themselves around the porch steps in their protective formation, alert but peaceful. "Grandpa Hal," Emma said sleepily, "why did Dr. Lizzie think money was more important than love?" Harold considered the question, seeking an answer that a 5-year-old could understand without losing the essential truth. Sometimes grown-ups get confused about what makes people happy. They think having lots of things is the same as being loved. But you and I know better, don't we? Emma nodded against his chest. The airplane people had everything, but they still needed to steal someone else's little girl to be happy. That's not real happiness. Out of the mouths of babes, Harold thought, his granddaughter had articulated something that apparently had escaped the adults who'd tried to destroy their family. Agent Chen had warned him that the media attention would intensify once the full scope of the trafficking ring became public. Harold Mackenzie, the elderly coal miner who'd refused to accept his granddaughter's death, would become a symbol of something larger, the triumph of love over money, family over system, instinct over authority. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by 7 loyal dogs and holding the child who'd been given back to him by what could only be called a miracle, Harold wasn't thinking about symbolism or media coverage. He was thinking about tomorrow morning, when Emma would wake up in her own bed, eat breakfast at their familiar kitchen table, and play with the dogs who'd never stopped believing she'd come home. The porch light cast a warm glow over their small family reunion, a beacon of hope in a story that had almost ended in darkness. Inside the house, Emma's drawings were still spread across the kitchen table, a child's testimony to the power of love that refuses to give up, even when all evidence suggests hope is lost. Faith lifted her head and looked directly at Harold, her golden eyes reflecting the porch light. In that gaze he saw acknowledgment of a job well done, a promise kept, and a bond that transcended the usual boundaries between species. These 7 dogs had saved Emma's life not through training or accident, but through the simple refusal to accept that their pack was incomplete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, court hearings, therapy sessions, the long process of healing from trauma. But tonight, Harold Mackenzie held his granddaughter close and listened to the peaceful breathing of 7 guardian angels who'd proven that sometimes the most important truths are found not in official reports or expert testimony, but in the faithful love that digs through lies to reach the light. The call came at 3:47 a.m., 3 weeks after Emma's rescue, shattering the fragile peace Harold had begun to believe might last. Detective Rodriguez's voice carried the weight of devastating news even before he spoke the words that would send Harold's world spinning into chaos once again. "Harold, we need you at Children's Hospital in Omaha immediately. Emma's been admitted to the ICU." Harold's hands shook as he gripped the phone, the familiar terror of losing Emma flooding back with the force of a mine shaft collapse. "What happened? She was fine when I put her to bed." She was laughing at Guardian trying to catch fireflies. "The doctors think it's delayed trauma from the original head injury. Her brain started swelling again around midnight." "Harold, it's serious. You need to get here now." The 2-hour drive to Omaha passed in a blur of dark highway and desperate prayers. The 7 dogs rode in the back of Harold's pickup truck, somehow sensing the emergency without being told. Faith kept her head pressed against the rear window, watching Harold through the glass as if willing him to drive faster. Children's Hospital of Nebraska stood like a fortress of glass and steel against the pre-dawn darkness, its windows glowing with the harsh light of medical urgency. Harold ran through the automatic doors with Faith at his heel, the other dogs following despite hospital regulations about animals in patient care areas. "Sir, you can't bring those dogs in here," a security guard began. But Dr. Rebecca Matthews, the pediatric neurologist, waved him off. "Let them through. This child has been through enough separation trauma." Dr. Matthews was a small woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many families destroyed by medical crises. She led Harold down a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and despair. "Mr. Mackenzie, I need to prepare you for what you're about to see." Emma lay in the pediatric ICU, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. Her small body seemed even tinier against the adult-sized hospital bed, her face pale as winter moonlight. Tubes and wires connected her to monitors that tracked every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of brain activity. The original injury was more severe than Dr. Sullivan indicated in her initial reports, Dr. Matthews explained, her voice clinical but not unkind. "It appears she masked the symptoms with medications that artificially reduced the swelling. When those drugs left Emma's system over the past few weeks, the delayed reaction set in." Harold sank into the bedside chair, his weathered hand finding Emma's small fingers among the medical tubing. Her skin felt cold, fragile as tissue paper. Is she going to? Will she be okay? The next 48 hours are critical. We've induced a medical coma to reduce brain activity while we try to control the swelling. Mr. Mackenzie, I have to be honest with you. Even if we can save her life, there may be permanent damage, memory loss, motor function impairment, cognitive delays. The words hit Harold like physical blows. After fighting so hard to get Emma back, after believing they'd overcome the worst trauma imaginable, the original injury was still trying to steal her away. It felt like a cruel joke played by a universe that had already taken too much from him. Faith approached the hospital bed cautiously, her nose testing the air around Emma's motionless form. The other dogs followed, arranging themselves in their protective formation around the ICU room despite the protests of nursing staff. Something about their presence seemed to calm the medical alarms, or perhaps Harold's blood pressure had stabilized enough that the machines stopped their urgent beeping. "There's something else, Doctor," Matthews said quietly. "The medical bills for Emma's care are going to be substantial. Specialized neurological treatment, possible long-term rehabilitation, medications that insurance often doesn't cover fully. I wanted you to know up front so you can make informed decisions." Harold looked at Emma's pale face, remembering Dr. Sullivan's words about poverty being worse than death. Even now, even after proving that love mattered more than money, the financial reality threatened to destroy what remained of their family. "How much are we talking about?" "Conservative estimate, $200,000 if she recovers fully. Potentially much more if she requires ongoing care." $200,000. Harold's annual pension was barely $10,000. He could sell the farmhouse, but the mortgage and Sarah's medical debt had left him with negative equity. The town's fundraising efforts had raised $8,000, a generous gesture that wouldn't even cover a week of ICU care. The cruel mathematics of American healthcare spread before him like a mind map showing all the ways a person could fall into darkness. He could fight for Emma's life and bankrupt them both, leaving her alive but trapped in a system that would never let them climb free of debt. Or he could... Harold shook his head violently, refusing to complete that thought. There was no alternative. Emma was his family, his responsibility, his heart walking around outside his body. Whatever it cost, whatever it took, he would find a way. "Doctor, what if I signed guardianship over to the state? Would Emma get better care through social services?" Dr. Matthews studied Harold's face, seeing the desperation of a man contemplating the unthinkable. "Mr. Mackenzie, I've seen many families face these impossible choices. But I've also seen what happens to children who lose their primary emotional attachment during medical crises. Emma needs you more than she needs expensive treatments." As if responding to her name, Emma's fingers twitched slightly in Harold's grasp. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment her breathing pattern changed. Faith immediately stood, her tail wagging cautiously as she sensed movement from her human pack member. "Emma? Darling, can you hear Grandpa?" Emma's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, but definitely conscious. Her mouth moved without sound, trying to form words around the breathing tube that assisted her damaged brain's efforts to control basic functions. "Don't try to talk, sweetheart. Just squeeze my hand if you can hear me." Emma's grip tightened weakly around Harold's fingers, the smallest possible gesture that carried the weight of entire worlds. She was still in there, still fighting, still refusing to give up on their small family. "Doctor." Matthews checked Emma's pupils and reflexes, her expression cautiously optimistic. "This is good, very good. She's responding to stimuli much better than I expected." Over the following hours, Emma's condition seemed to stabilize. The dangerous swelling showed signs of responding to treatment, and her vital signs strengthened. But the financial reality remained unchanged. Every day in the ICU added thousands of dollars to a bill Harold could never hope to pay. By afternoon, word had spread through Willowbrook about Emma's crisis. Harold's phone began buzzing with messages from neighbors, former co-workers, people he barely knew offering whatever help they could provide. Mrs. Patterson, the grocery store owner who'd initially criticized Harold's ability to care for Emma, called to say she was organizing another fundraiser. "Harold, honey, we're not going to let that little girl suffer because of money. This community takes care of its own." But even the combined generosity of Willowbrook couldn't bridge the gap between rural kindness and metropolitan medical costs. Harold found himself staring at release forms and payment agreements, trying to decipher language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify the financial obligations he was signing. Agent Chen arrived that evening with news that provided a different kind of complication. The FBI has frozen the assets of the trafficking network, about $4.2 million recovered so far from the Ashworths and their associates. Legally, Emma would be entitled to victim compensation from those funds. Harold looked up from the medical forms, hope flickering in his chest like a candle in a mine shaft. How long would that take? Months? Possibly years. The legal process for distributing seized assets is notoriously slow, and there are 47 other victims with claims. By the time Emma sees any compensation, by then it would be too late. Emma needed treatment now, not after a lengthy court process divided limited funds among dozens of traumatized families. As night settled over the hospital, Harold made a decision that went against every principle he'd lived by. He called the number Dr. Matthews had given him for the hospital's financial counselor, preparing to discuss payment plans that would stretch the rest of his natural life and probably beyond. But before he could dial, Emma's eyes opened fully for the first time since her collapse. Her voice, barely a whisper around the medical tubes, formed 3 words that stopped Harold's heart. "Are we poor, Grandpa?" Harold looked at his granddaughter, bandaged, connected to machines, fighting for her life in a hospital room they couldn't afford, and felt something break inside his chest. Not from despair, but from the realization that poverty had become a weapon someone had tried to use against their family. "No, darling," he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "We're not poor. We have each other, and that makes us rich in all the ways that matter." Emma's lips curved into the faintest smile. "And we have our puppy angels." Faith pressed closer to the hospital bed, her warm presence a reminder that some forms of wealth couldn't be measured in dollars or denied by circumstances. The other 6 dogs maintained their vigil around the ICU room, their loyalty unwavering despite the antiseptic environment and the constant activity of medical staff. Harold squeezed Emma's hand gently, feeling her grip strengthen in response. Tomorrow would bring new financial realities, more impossible decisions, the crushing weight of medical debt that could destroy their future. But tonight, Emma was alive, awake, and surrounded by love that no one could take away or put a price tag on. The machines continued their electronic monitoring, the hospital buzzed with its 24-hour cycle of crisis and recovery, and somewhere in California, FBI agents were still tracking down children who had been stolen from families like theirs. But in room 347 of Children's Hospital of Nebraska, a grandfather held his granddaughter's hand while 7 loyal dogs maintained their vigil, proving once again that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, sold, or taken away by those who confused money with meaning. The truth began unraveling at 6:23 a.m. on Emma's 4th day in the ICU, when Agent Chen burst through the hospital room door with the expression that mixed triumph and horror in equal measure. Harold looked up from Emma's bedside, where he'd been reading Charlotte's Web, to his granddaughter's unconscious form, Faith's head resting on his feet. "Harold, we need to talk, now." Agent Chen's voice carried an urgency that made the 7 dogs lift their heads in unison. "What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything we thought we knew about Emma's case." Dr. Matthews arrived moments later, her face pale with the kind of shock that comes from discovering your professional assumptions were built on lies. "Mr. Mackenzie, we've been reviewing Dr. Sullivan's medical records more carefully. The original injury report from Miller's Pond, it's been falsified." Harold felt the world tilt sideways. The same sensation he'd experienced in mine collapses when solid ground suddenly became unreliable. "What do you mean, falsified?" Agent Chen pulled out a tablet, her fingers scrolling through digital documents. "We found Dr. Sullivan's real notes in her personal files. Harold, Emma never had a severe head injury. The trauma was minimal, a minor concussion at worst. Dr. Sullivan deliberately exaggerated the symptoms to justify her actions." The words hit Harold like a cave-in, crushing his understanding of the past month. "But Emma was unconscious when I pulled her from the pond. She wasn't breathing. She was in shock from the cold water and brief submersion, a frightening but not life-threatening condition that would have resolved with basic medical care." Dr. Matthews sat down heavily, her professional composure cracking. "Dr. Sullivan used a paralytic agent to simulate severe brain trauma, then maintained the deception with a combination of sedatives and careful documentation." Harold's hands began to shake as the implications crystallized. "You're telling me my granddaughter was never dying? That this whole nightmare was manufactured from the beginning," Agent Chen confirmed. "Dr. Sullivan identified Emma as a target months ago during routine checkups. She studied your financial situation, your social isolation, the community's attitude toward your ability to care for Emma. She was preparing for the perfect opportunity." The room spun around Harold as 20 years of mining accidents and 3 years of Sarah's cancer treatments had taught him to recognize when disaster struck without warning. But this was different. This was discovering that the disaster had been deliberately engineered by someone he'd trusted with his granddaughter's life. "The current medical crisis?" Harold managed to ask. Dr. Matthews checked Emma's monitors, her voice clinical but gentler than before. "Real, but likely triggered by the psychological trauma of her captivity and the medications Dr. Sullivan used to maintain her deception. The brain swelling is Emma's body's delayed reaction to chemical manipulation, not physical injury." Emma stirred in her hospital bed, her eyes fluttering open with increasing clarity. The breathing tube had been removed the previous day, and her voice, though weak, carried the stubborn determination Harold remembered from before their world collapsed. "Grandpa Hal? Why does everyone look so angry?" Harold forced his expression into calmness, the way he'd learned to control his features when mine inspectors delivered bad news to anxious families. "We just found out some things about Dr. Lizzie, sweetheart. Things that help us understand what really happened to you." Agent Chen knelt beside Emma's bed, her voice taking on the gentle tone investigators used with child witnesses. "Emma, do you remember Dr. Lizzie giving you any shots or medicines at Miller's Pond?" Emma's brow furrowed with the effort of recalling traumatic events her mind had tried to suppress. "She said it would help with the pain in my head, but it made me feel sleepy and far away, like I was watching everything happen to someone else." "Did she give you other medicines while you were staying at her house?" "Every day. Pink pills and white pills and sometimes shots that made me feel confused. When I asked questions about Grandpa Hal, she would give me extra medicine and I couldn't think straight anymore." Emma's voice grew smaller. "I started to believe maybe she was right about you being dead, because I couldn't remember things clearly." Harold closed his eyes, fighting back rage at the systematic way Dr. Sullivan had chemically manipulated his granddaughter's perceptions. Not only had she kidnapped Emma, she'd used medication to make the child doubt her own memories and instincts. Dr. Matthews made notes in Emma's chart, her handwriting sharp with controlled anger. The good news is that with proper treatment and the right medications out of her system, Emma should make a full recovery. The current brain swelling is responding well to treatment, and there's no reason to expect permanent damage. Agent Chen's tablet buzzed with an incoming message. She read it quickly, her expression growing grimmer. "There's more. We've been tracking the financial records from the trafficking network. Harold, the Ashworths paid Dr. Sullivan $75,000 for Emma specifically." "$75,000?" Harold's voice came out as a croak. Dr. Sullivan provided them with detailed reports about Emma's personality, health records, even photographs taken during medical appointments. They requested a blonde 5-year-old with specific characteristics to replace their deceased daughter. Emma wasn't randomly selected. She was custom ordered. The horror of being reduced to a catalog item, of having his granddaughter evaluated and priced like livestock, made Harold's stomach lurch. Faith sensed his distress and pressed closer, her warm presence a reminder that some bonds couldn't be commodified. "There's something else," Agent Chen continued. "The network kept detailed records of their operations. We've identified 47 other children, but Emma's case was different. Most of the other victims came from families with multiple children, single parents, or situations where the disappearance could be attributed to neglect or accident. You were specifically targeted because of your age and financial situation." Emma struggled to sit up in her hospital bed, her young face showing a maturity that broke Harold's heart. "They picked me because you're old and poor?" Harold took her small hand in his weathered ones. "They picked you because they thought those things meant I couldn't love you properly. They were wrong about that, weren't they?" "Very wrong." Emma's voice carried the fierce loyalty Harold had inherited from his own grandmother, a woman who'd raised 8 children during the Great Depression without ever doubting her worth as a mother. "Poor people love just as much as rich people. Maybe more, because we know love is all we got." Dr. Matthews smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "Emma, you're wiser than most adults I know." Agent Chen's phone rang, and she stepped away to answer it. When she returned, her expression had shifted from grim determination to something approaching amazement. "That was the Nebraska Attorney General's office. The story of Emma's rescue has gone viral on social media. A GoFundMe campaign started by your neighbors has raised over $200,000 in the past 48 hours. But that's not the biggest news." Harold felt another shift in the foundation of his understanding. "What do you mean?" "A production company in Los Angeles wants to buy the rights to Emma's story. They're offering $500,000 for a television movie about the dogs that saved her life, and there's interest from 3 different publishers about a book deal." The numbers felt surreal, like someone was describing events happening to strangers rather than his own family. Harold had spent his entire adult life worried about having enough money for groceries and utilities. Now he was being told that their trauma had suddenly become valuable entertainment. "I don't want people to make money from what happened to Emma." "You wouldn't be giving them permission to exploit her story," Agent Chen explained. "You'd be controlling how it's told while providing financial security for her future. Emma's medical bills, her education, therapy, everything she'll need, it could all be covered." Emma tugged on Harold's sleeve, her eyes bright with returning strength. "Grandpa, if telling our story helps other kids like me, shouldn't we tell it?" From the mouths of babes. Harold looked at his granddaughter, seeing not just the 5-year-old who'd been stolen from him, but the woman she would grow up to become. Someone who understood that surviving trauma gave you the responsibility to help others survive theirs. "Doctor, Matthews approached with Emma's latest test results, her expression cautiously optimistic. The brain swelling has reduced significantly. If this trend continues, Emma should be able to go home within the week. Home. The word carried weight that Harold had taken for granted until it was threatened. Their farmhouse with its peeling paint and second-hand furniture, the kitchen table where Emma did her coloring, the porch where 7 dogs waited patiently for their evening meal, all of it suddenly precious beyond measure. "There's one more thing," Agent Chen said, checking her notes. "Dr. Sullivan has agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. She's providing detailed information about the entire network, including names, locations, and financial records that will help us recover the other missing children." Harold felt a complex mixture of emotions toward the woman who'd tried to destroy his family. Hatred for what she'd done, pity for the grief that had driven her to such extremes, and a grudging respect for her decision to help undo the damage she'd caused. Will she serve time? 15 to 20 years, likely? The federal charges for child trafficking are serious, but her cooperation and the psychological evaluation showing genuine remorse will work in her favor. Agent Chen paused. "She asked me to give you a message. She said to tell you that watching Emma fight to get back to you made her realize she was wrong about everything. Love isn't about what you can provide. It's about showing up every day, no matter what." As if summoned by the conversation, Emma sat up straighter in her hospital bed, her color improving visibly. "Grandpa Hal, when we go home, can we visit Dr. Lizzie? I think she's really sad and needs to know I forgive her." Harold stared at his granddaughter, amazed by the capacity for forgiveness that trauma hadn't been able to destroy. Emma had every right to hate Dr. Sullivan, to want her to suffer for the fear and confusion she'd caused. Instead, she was worried about her kidnapper's emotional well-being. "We'll see, darling. First, we need to get you completely healthy." The 7 dogs had remained quiet during the intense revelations, but now they began to stir with the excitement that preceded good news. Faith approached Emma's bed and gently placed her paw on the blanket, her tail wagging with the slow rhythm of deep contentment. "She knows I'm getting better," Emma said, scratching behind Faith's ears. "Dogs always know things before people do." Agent Chen gathered her materials, preparing to leave. "Harold, there's one final piece of information you should know. The FBI is recommending Faith and the other dogs for official recognition as civilian heroes. Their actions directly led to solving this case and potentially saving dozens of other children." Harold looked at the 7 dogs who'd refused to let him bury a lie, who'd known Emma was alive when every expert had pronounced her dead, who'd transformed from unwanted strays into the instruments of his family's salvation. "They're not heroes," Harold said quietly. "They're just family members who didn't give up." Emma clapped her hands together weakly, her eyes sparkling with returning energy. "Can we have a party for them when we go home? With dog cake and everything?" "We'll have the biggest party Willowbrook has ever seen," Harold promised, feeling hope settle in his chest like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. As the day progressed, Emma's improvement accelerated. The medications Dr. Sullivan had used to manipulate her brain chemistry were finally clearing from her system, allowing her natural resilience to assert itself. By evening, she was sitting up unassisted, eating solid food, and asking when she could see her drawings again. Dr. Matthews completed her final examination with obvious satisfaction. "Barring any unexpected complications, Emma can go home tomorrow morning. She'll need follow-up care and therapy to process her psychological trauma, but physically, she's made a remarkable recovery." Harold spent that night in the hospital chair, watching Emma sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. The 7 dogs had arranged themselves around the room in their protective formation, but their vigilance had relaxed into contentment. Their pack was complete again, their mission accomplished. As dawn approached, Harold reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a broken old man preparing to bury his granddaughter. Today, he was planning their return home, their future secured by a combination of community generosity, media interest, and the kind of justice that seemed too good to be true. Emma stirred as morning light filtered through the hospital windows. Her eyes opened clear and focused, meeting Harold's gaze with the trust and love that no amount of money could purchase. "Good morning, Grandpa Hal. Are we rich now?" Harold smiled, thinking about the GoFundMe donations, the movie deal, the book offers, and all the financial security that had materialized from their darkest moments. But mostly he thought about Emma's hand in his, Faith's head on his feet, and the 6 other dogs who'd proven that the most valuable things in life couldn't be stolen or sold. "We were always rich, darling. We just didn't know it yet." 6 months later, Harold Mackenzie stood on the front porch of his newly renovated farmhouse, watching Emma chase fireflies across a yard that had been transformed by community love and unexpected prosperity. The peeling paint had been replaced with fresh white clapboard, the sagging steps rebuilt with sturdy oak, and the broken shutters restored to their original forest green. But the changes that mattered most couldn't be seen from the outside. The Seven Guardians Animal Sanctuary occupied 30 acres adjacent to Harold's property, funded by the movie deal that had brought Emma's story to millions of viewers worldwide. The film, titled 7 Angels, had premiered 3 weeks earlier to critical acclaim and box office success that nobody had anticipated. But for Harold, watching Emma train rescue puppies in the morning sunshine, the money was secondary to the healing it had made possible. "Grandpa Hal, come see what Hope learned," Emma called from the training yard, where the border collie was demonstrating her new ability to locate missing persons by scent. At 5.5 years old, Emma had become an unofficial ambassador for the sanctuary, her natural way with animals drawing visitors from across the country. The trauma counseling doctor Patricia Novak had recommended had proven essential to Emma's recovery. The nightmares had gradually faded, replaced by dreams about flying with 7 winged dogs above the Nebraska plains. Emma's art therapy had evolved from drawings of confinement to expansive landscapes filled with families of all shapes and sizes, protected by guardian animals who never slept. "She's learned to track scents across water," Harold said, joining Emma beside Hope's training area. "That's advanced work for any dog, let alone one who taught herself." Emma beamed with pride, her blonde hair catching the autumn sunlight. The medical crisis that had nearly killed her had left no lasting physical effects, but it had deepened her understanding of how precious and fragile life could be. She approached each day with an intensity that reminded Harold of Sarah's determination to squeeze every moment of joy from her cancer-shortened life. The sanctuary had become much more than a home for Emma's 7 rescuers. Word had spread through law enforcement networks about the dog's remarkable tracking abilities, and the facility now trained search and rescue teams from 6 states. Faith had been officially certified as a therapy dog, visiting children's hospitals and trauma centers where her gentle presence helped young patients process their own difficult experiences. Detective Rodriguez arrived that afternoon with news that had become routine over the past months. Another child from Dr. Sullivan's network had been successfully reunited with their family. The FBI's investigation had expanded to include similar operations in 12 states, ultimately recovering 63 stolen children and dismantling a trafficking network that had operated for over a decade. "The Patterson boy from Oregon was reunited with his grandmother yesterday," Rodriguez reported, settling into the porch chair that had become his unofficial office during visits to the sanctuary. That makes 58 successful recoveries so far. Harold felt the familiar mixture of joy and sorrow that accompanied these updates. Every reunion represented a family restored, but also highlighted how many children had been stolen from their homes by people who believed love could be improved with money. Emma looked up from brushing Guardian's coat, her expression serious beyond her years. "What about the other kids, the ones they haven't found yet?" "We're still looking, sweetheart." "Your testimony helped us identify several more locations where children might have been placed. Every piece of information helps us bring more families together." The legal proceedings had concluded 2 months earlier with Dr. Catherine Sullivan sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Her cooperation with investigators had been complete and seemingly genuine, providing details that led to arrests across the trafficking network. Harold had testified at her sentencing hearing, describing the systematic way she had targeted his family and the psychological manipulation Emma had endured. But Emma had made an unexpected request that surprised everyone involved in the case. She wanted to visit Dr. Sullivan in prison. "She needs to know I forgive her," Emma had explained to the family therapist who was helping her process her trauma. "She lost her little girl and it made her do terrible things. But holding on to angry feelings won't bring Margaret back or help the other kids who got stolen." The visit had been arranged through the federal prison system with careful psychological preparation for both Emma and Dr. Sullivan. Harold had been skeptical about exposing Emma to her kidnapper again, but Dr. Novak had supported the idea as potentially therapeutic for everyone involved. The prison meeting had lasted 30 minutes. Emma had brought a drawing she'd made specifically for Dr. Sullivan, a picture of Margaret in heaven, surrounded by other children who'd died too young, all of them watching over the living world with benevolent expressions. "Doctor, Lizzie cried when she saw it," Emma had reported afterward. "She said Margaret would have liked being friends with me if things had been different. She asked me to tell you she was sorry for trying to steal your granddaughter and that watching us together made her realize she was wrong about everything." Doctor. Sullivan had also provided the final piece of information that closed the case. The trafficking network had been planning to expand their operations to include elderly victims, targeting senior citizens with valuable property or assets who could be declared incompetent and moved to facilities where their resources could be systematically drained. "Your grandfather would have been next," Agent Chen had explained during her final case briefing. Dr. Sullivan was supposed to evaluate his mental capacity and recommend guardianship changes that would have placed you in foster care and him in a nursing facility. They would have taken everything. The revelation had sent chills through Harold, realizing how completely their lives had been mapped out for destruction by strangers who viewed human relationships as obstacles to profit. But it had also reinforced his gratitude for the 7 dogs whose instincts had disrupted a plan that would have separated them forever. The sanctuary's success had brought unexpected opportunities. The Nebraska Department of Agriculture had contracted with Harold to develop training protocols for animal-assisted search and rescue operations. His 40 years of mining experience had proven surprisingly relevant to understanding how scent tracking worked in challenging terrain. "These dogs think like miners," Harold had explained to a visiting delegation from the National Search and Rescue Association. "They understand that the most direct path isn't always the most effective one. They work systematically, checking every possible route until they find what they're looking for." Emma had become the sanctuary's unofficial spokesperson, her natural comfort with cameras and interviewers making her a compelling advocate for animal rescue and family preservation. The book about their experience, co-authored by Harold and Emma with help from a professional writer, had become a bestseller with proceeds funding similar sanctuaries in rural communities across America. The Seven Guardians Foundation now operated facilities in 8 states, providing homes for abandoned animals while training them for search and rescue work. Each location employed local residents like Harold, people with practical skills and deep knowledge of their communities, who could manage both the animals and the human relationships that made rescue work successful. Mayor Patricia Hendricks had publicly apologized for the town council's initial hostility toward Harold and his dogs. Willowbrook now promoted itself as the home of the Seven Guardians, with tourism from the movie and book bringing economic vitality the community hadn't seen since the grain elevator closed 20 years earlier. "We learned something important from Harold and Emma," Mayor Hendricks had said during the sanctuary's grand opening ceremony. "Sometimes the things we're quickest to reject are exactly what we need most. Those dogs everyone wanted to get rid of became the heroes who saved not just Emma, but our whole understanding of what family really means." The evening routine at the Mackenzie farmhouse had evolved to accommodate their expanded family. Emma would help Harold prepare dinner for all 7 dogs, arranging their bowls in the same protective circle they'd maintained since their first day on the property. After the dogs ate, Emma would spend an hour in the training yard working on basic commands with the newest rescue animals who arrived almost weekly. Faith had claimed a permanent position as Emma's sleeping companion, the German Shepherd's presence helping ease the nightmares that still occasionally disrupted the child's rest. The other dogs had paired with various community members who visited the sanctuary regularly, elderly residents who found companionship with animals that seemed to understand the value of patient, unconditional love. Mrs. Patterson, the grocery store owner who'd initially criticized Harold's parenting, now visited twice weekly to help with puppy socialization. "These dogs taught me that judging someone based on appearances is usually wrong," she'd admitted to Harold. "I looked at you and saw an old man who couldn't handle responsibility. They looked at you and saw family worth protecting." As autumn deepened into early winter, Emma's 6th birthday approached with a celebration that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. The community had planned a festival celebrating the anniversary of her rescue, with proceeds supporting the foundation's expansion to additional states. But for Emma, the most important aspect of her birthday was the opportunity to announce the sanctuary's newest program, training therapy dogs specifically for children who'd experienced trauma similar to her own. "Kids who've been scared need friends who understand being scared," Emma explained to the local newspaper reporter documenting the program's launch. "Dogs who've been abandoned know exactly how it feels to wonder if anyone will ever love you again. They make the best helpers because they remember what it's like to need rescuing." The program had attracted attention from child psychologists nationwide, many of whom recognized the innovative approach of pairing traumatized children with rescued animals as potentially revolutionary in treating complex PTSD. Dr. Novak had agreed to oversee the psychological aspects of the program, ensuring that both the children and animals received appropriate support. Harold found himself becoming something he'd never expected, a minor celebrity whose story resonated with audiences far beyond Nebraska. Speaking requests arrived weekly from organizations focused on family preservation, animal rescue, and rural community development. But Harold was selective about his appearances, accepting only those that directly supported the foundation's mission. "I'm not interested in being famous," he'd told Emma during one of their evening conversations on the porch. "I'm interested in making sure what happened to us helps prevent it happening to other families." Emma had nodded solemnly, her understanding of their public role maturing alongside her overall development. "Like how the 7 angels helped us. And now we help other people find their angels?" "Exactly like that, darling." The financial security that had resulted from their ordeal felt surreal to Harold, who'd spent 70 years worrying about money. The movie deal, book royalties, and foundation donations had created a trust fund that would ensure Emma's education and care for the rest of her life. But more importantly, It had provided the resources to help other families facing similar challenges. Money problems were never really about the money, Harold had realized during one of his therapy sessions with Dr. Novak. They were about feeling powerless to protect the people you love. Now that Emma's safe and we can help others, the money is just a tool instead of a source of fear. Emma's artwork had evolved from documentation of trauma to celebration of resilience. Her latest series depicted children and animals from around the world, all connected by invisible threads of love and protection that transcended species, geography, and circumstance. Several pieces had been selected for exhibition in the Nebraska State Capitol, with Emma serving as the youngest artist ever featured in the building's permanent collection. As Harold tucked Emma into bed on a crisp October evening, surrounded by the 7 dogs who'd never stopped believing in their family's survival, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point of peaceful contentment. "Grandpa Hal," Emma said sleepily, "do you think Dr. Lizzie is sorry she tried to take me away from you?" Harold considered the question, thinking about the broken woman who'd confused money with love, who'd tried to solve her grief by stealing someone else's happiness. "I think she's learning that families can't be improved by tearing them apart, and I think she's grateful you were strong enough to forgive her." Emma nodded, satisfied with this explanation. "Tomorrow, can we work on training the new puppies? The little golden retriever reminds me of Faith when she was young." "We'll work on whatever you want to work on, darling." "We've got all the time in the world." Outside their renovated farmhouse, the Nebraska wind carried the scent of autumn across fields that had witnessed both tragedy and triumph. The 7 guardians. Animal Sanctuary stood as proof that love multiplied when shared, that loyalty transcended circumstances, and that sometimes the most important rescues were performed by those who'd needed rescuing themselves. In the distance, the lights of Willowbrook twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family that had learned the difference between having everything and having what mattered. And in the warmth of a house filled with the gentle breathing of sleeping dogs and the absolute security of unconditional love, Harold Mackenzie closed his eyes and dreamed of tomorrow's possibilities. At 67, Harold Mackenzie thought his purpose had died with his granddaughter Emma, until 7 abandoned dogs refused to let him bury a lie. When those worthless strays dug up Emma's grave during her funeral, revealing dolls instead of her body, they didn't just save a kidnapped child, they proved that love transcends every limitation society places on us. Harold's fixed income, his age, his burden of caring for both a child and stray animals, none of it mattered when measured against the fierce loyalty that defines real family. Dr. Sullivan tried to steal Emma because she believed poverty disqualified Harold from parenthood, that money could improve upon love. She was wrong. The same community that once questioned Harold's abilities rallied to support him when truth emerged. His story became a bestseller. His sanctuary now trains rescue dogs across 8 states, and Emma thrives not despite their humble beginnings but because of the unshakable foundation they provided. Your age isn't a limitation, it's accumulated wisdom. Your circumstances aren't obstacles, they're the soil where authentic relationships grow. Sometimes the very things society tells you make you less than are exactly what make you irreplaceable. What burden in your life might actually be your greatest blessing? When has being underestimated given you the freedom to prove everyone wrong? Share your story below. Your experience matters more than you know.